Thank you for coming to the AFIKRA presentation. My name is Sima Bou Jawde, and today we will be discussing the book White Tears, Brown Scars by Ruby Hamad. And essentially, it is how white feminism betrays women of color. So just a brief background, White Tears, Brown Scars by Ruby Hamad catalyzed the debate on how white feminism essentially aids in abating and silencing the lived experiences of women of color, and they do so by utilizing the literal tears or their uncomfortableness once they are in a situation where they feel as if women of color are sharing their lived experiences, and so essentially aiding white supremacy. A brief background: Ruby Hamad is actually a journalist, academic, and scholar. She was born in Lebanon and raised in Australia. Currently, she's finishing her PhD in media and post-colonial studies at the University of New South Wales. And her research focuses on criticism and media coverage of Arabs and the Middle East in general. She splits her time between New York and Sydney. We commence with a quote from the book, and essentially it says, "The greatest obstacle to liberation and equity is the consciousness and unconscious biases against women of color that we all carry and are shaped and cemented by years of socialization into a system that is fundamentally racist and sexist." So this is, I would say, encompassing of the thesis, or let's say the main argument that Ruby Hamad presents in the book, and we will explore that through three primary themes. Essentially, first, we will look at what is white feminism, and white feminism continues to universalize what white women concerns believe is all encompassing for all women of color, when that is actually not true. So hence they are pushing an agenda that not necessarily encompasses all the voices of women worldwide. And we will be focusing on how does that affect the Arab diaspora through archetypes, which we will soon talk about. But how do we also see that manifestation of white feminism back home, and how our own racist views can be detrimental for equity at large? First of all, we begin by understanding the archetype of the Orient, which I'm sure we've heard a lot about with scholars such as Edward Said, who have decreed how we are viewed as the Orient, with such as uncivilized, barbaric, backwards, weak, or feminized. But essentially, I want to focus on how women were portrayed and how they were degraded. We have a prominent French writer, Gustave Flaubert, who described Egyptian women as machines who do not discriminate when it comes to sexual partners, which they essentially desired and devalued an Arab woman's an Arab woman and relegate her to only a body, and that is essentially a rationale for white supremacists to keep on oppressing both women and the population at large. So that was how the Orient, how the West portrayed the Orient. But that archetype developed and evolved contemporarily in how the perception of Arab women is now seen either as pets or threats. And we see that through pets, as in the woman is docile or needs help or always in need of a savior, versus the extreme in which a woman, or again, population at large, is vilified and seen as evil and wreaking of havoc. And that is viewed, and that is extensively documented in Jack Shaheen Vilification of the Arabs in Hollywood, and that's also another avenue. But that is essentially boxing our lived experiences into two binaries, either as docile or as villains. And a great example from Ruby Hamad's book is Zena, who is a Palestinian Canadian who literally was approached by a white woman in her workplace, in which the white woman proceeded to pet her hair, her curly hair, because that is exotic in a sense. And once she confronted HR about that incident, actually, Zena was the one who was reprimanded. She was asked to apologize to her colleague because she was creating a toxic and hostile environment, versus actually these built-in racist stereotypes, which make women believe that they can subjugate these women and, you know, make them and treat them as docile pets. So that is just one example from the book. But we see a manifestation and the consequences of these archetypes to this day, both in media and politics. And we see how white feminism is detrimental in these two avenues, with these two jarring examples. One, where in several summers ago, both Mina Massoud and Judy Whittaker were cast in leading roles. For us, having a leading role from an Arab background that is not a villain, that's actually portraying Aladdin, widely, you know, widely revered. I would say, like, I grew up watching Aladdin, versus having this white woman also take a leading role. While we were ecstatic, white women completely disregarded that fact and elevated Judy Whittaker and said this was a step for feminism everywhere, completely actually undermining our representation in the media. More so, we also see an example for the elections in which essentially essentially we see when Clinton ran as president, and we know that she has been pro-Iraq war. She has extensively applied rigorous and detrimental Middle Eastern policies that affect our population negatively. And once, if we were to question or critique Clinton's political stances, we would be seen as anti-feminist. But that's not the case, because essentially we are simply adding political criticism, but it is being cloaked by gender equity. And that is when white feminism is detrimental to our plight as women globally. And we see that resonate in the MENA region, where actually one of the most prominent feminism, Huda Sha'rawi in Egypt, did not want to associate herself with white feminisms. Why? Because white feminists did not see Palestine as a colonial entity, while feminists in the Arab region could not divorce imperialism and national liberation from gender equity. And white feminists simply did not have that in their agenda, nor did they want to push for Palestinian liberation, or viewed imperialism as oppressive in the Middle East. But that is not to say that we also do not exploit and oppress others. And we actually see that in racism, as seen by the horrific kafala system in Lebanon or in the Gulf state, where migrant workers are essentially enslaved in modern day, with what we know as modern day slavery. And so while we are critical of white feminism, white feminists oppressing us, what about our own views back home? How does this book, or in general, how should we move forward when it comes to us in our fight for liberation against systems of oppression? And the way forward is understanding intersectionality. And intersectionality is knowing, and not only knowing, it is working towards equity from for people of different educational backgrounds, sexuality, ability, culture, ethnicities. It is understanding that that proper justice is intersectional between all these struggles, and hence we can better understand lived experiences of all populations. And we must also reckon with our own prejudice. How are we being oppressed while also being oppressors to others? And most importantly, we must always elevate the voices of the marginalized, which was what Ruby Hamad was trying to do, and did so eloquently in her book, by really delving into how Arab women are perceived and oppressed. And essentially not only Arab women, but women who identifies Latinx or Asian, or essentially any other minor ethnicity. But for the focus of our AFIKRA talk, I discussed mostly Arab perception. And finally, I would recommend other books that elevate women's voices and help center intersectionality in the conversation. Essentially, the book was sparked by Ruby Hamad's article, How White Women Use Strategic Tears to Silence Women of Color, which then became this book. I would recommend Our Women on the Ground, really centering the voices and resilience and inspiration, I would say, of Our Women on the Ground. I would look at Rage Becomes Her by Soraya Shimali and Sister Outsider by Audre Lorde. Thank you all for your time. I appreciate you listening to this talk. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at simabujawde@gmail.com. Thank you very much for your time. That is all.